The sun was rising slowly over the house where Liz, a 65-year-old woman, was gazing at the landscape outside. She sat alone in the living room, her eyes fixed on the window. A deep emptiness filled her. It had been 2 months since James, her husband of nearly 50 years, had left her. He had traded her for a woman 23 years younger, a woman named Patricia, 45 years old. Liz could barely understand what was happening. James, a controlling and sexist man, had never allowed Liz to work or venture outside the walls of their home. "Your place is here, taking care of me and the house," he would say, his voice deep and with an air of superiority. And Liz, even in moments of doubt, conformed to the role imposed on her. But now, reality hit her like a cold blow. Alone, she didn't know how to support herself. That day, Liz walked through the house, touching the old furniture she had cared for over the decades. The finances were tight. James had taken almost everything, including the car and most of the money from their bank account. All she had left was the house, but without any income, the future looked uncertain. Liz sat at the kitchen table, her head down, thinking about how much her life had changed. The neighbors began to notice James's absence and Liz's fragile state. Mrs. Clodold, a woman who lived in the house next door, knocked on her door one morning. Liz opened it slowly, trying to hide her sad eyes. "Liz, dear, how are you?" Mrs. Clotilde asked, her voice full of concern. "I heard that James left. If you need anything, you can count on me." Liz felt a sting of shame, but the kindness in Mrs. Clotilde's voice made her open up. Through tears, she shared the story of James leaving, her fear of the future, and her lack of any experience to earn a living. "I don't know what to do, Clotilde," Liz said, her voice choked with emotion. "I've never worked outside. I've always just been a wife and a homemaker." Mrs. Clotilde hugged Liz and comforted her. "We'll figure this out. You're not alone. The community will help you." And so the first wave of support began. The neighborhood church, where Liz used to attend Sunday Mass, also mobilized. Father Charles soon learned of the situation and organized a meeting with the congregation to see how they could assist. During those first days, Liz received basic food baskets, small donations, and most importantly, words of encouragement. But the reality was harsh. Liz would need to find a way to support herself. She started considering selling some of the old furniture and items she had at home, but her heart ached at the thought of parting with a lifetime of memories. Meanwhile, news about James and his new partner began to reach her. Patricia was a lively woman who loved to flaunt her lifestyle. Mutual friends mentioned that James was spending lavishly on expensive restaurants and luxurious trips. Liz listened to these reports with a mix of sadness and anger. How could he, after so many years of marriage, abandon everything and blow through what they had built together? That's when a friend from church, Martha, a lawyer, offered her support. "Liz, you have rights. This man can't just go off spending all the money and leave you in this situation. You need to go to court," Martha said firmly. The idea of facing James in court scared Liz, but she knew she had to do something to secure some stability. From that moment on, a long battle began. Martha filed a lawsuit against James, demanding the division of the assets accumulated over the years. The case drew the attention of the small community where Liz lived, and everyone followed it closely. Liz found herself on a path she never imagined she'd walk, but she knew she had to fight for herself. Meanwhile, James continued to indulge in his new life, oblivious to the impending danger. Every new expense, every fancy dinner, and extravagant trip became more proof of his recklessness and disregard for Liz. But she, determined, found strength in her faith and in the solidarity of the community to move forward. Liz's days followed with a mix of anguish and hope. Every morning, she tried to find the strength to keep going, even as fear of the future lurked constantly. Her routine was completely different now. The moments of silence in the house were deafening, and the echo of Liz's lonely footsteps down the hallways made the solitude feel even crueler. Martha, the lawyer, made frequent visits to discuss the progress of the case against James. They spent entire afternoons reviewing documents and gathering evidence of everything that had been built during the years of marriage. "We need records of all the transactions he made in the past few months," Martha would say, with the firmness only an experienced lawyer possesses. Liz knew this was a difficult step, but an essential one to secure her future. Meanwhile, the community became increasingly involved. The church group, led by Father Charles, organized small initiatives to raise funds and support Liz while the legal process was underway. Mrs. Clotilde, always present, started coming over every day to help with the housework and keep her company in the afternoons, bringing light conversations and words of comfort. "Liz, don't give up. This is just a rough patch. And it will pass," she would say, trying to encourage her friend to keep moving forward. It was during one of these afternoons, while Liz and Mrs. Clotilde were having tea on the porch, that an unusual scene unfolded. A luxury car pulled up in front of the house, and out came James, accompanied by Patricia. She was dressed in expensive clothes, flaunting a designer handbag that was worth more than anything Liz owned at that moment. Liz's blood ran cold. Her heart raced, and she felt her breathing grow heavy. "What is he doing here?" she thought, trying to stay calm. James walked up to the door with a forced smile on his face, while Patricia stood back, arms crossed, with a look of disdain. "Liz, we need to talk," he said in a tone mixing superiority and coldness. Without waiting for a response, he stepped into the house as if he still owned everything. Liz felt a rage grow inside her, but she stood firm. "James, you have no right to just walk in like this." "This is my house now," she said, her voice trembling but steady. James laughed, a cold, sarcastic laugh. "Your house? Liz, we both know this house only exists because of me, and I'm here to pick up some of my things." He then began rummaging through the living room, grabbing random items and tossing them into a leather bag he carried. Liz stood frozen in disbelief, not knowing how to react. She wanted to scream, to throw him out, but something held her back. Mrs. Clotilde, sensing the rising tension, stepped closer and stood beside Liz, like a shield. "James, you don't have the right to do this," Clotilde said, her voice surprisingly firm for a woman her age. "Everything you're doing only proves that Liz is right to take you to court." James turned with a look of fury. "You all don't understand anything. I'm living the life I deserve now. Finally free to do whatever I want," he replied as he finished filling his bag. Before leaving, he gave Liz one last look, filled with contempt. "I hope you understand soon enough that life goes on. Liz, stop playing the victim." As soon as he left, Liz crumbled. The tears she had held back for so long came flooding out uncontrollably. Mrs. Clotilde hugged her tightly, letting her cry as much as she needed. "He'll pay for this, Liz." "He will pay," her friend whispered, trying to soothe her. The next day, Martha paid an urgent visit. "Liz, we need to speed up the process," she said as she came in. "We've obtained documents proving that James is wasting the money you both accumulated on frivolous things. He's going to drown himself in debt if we don't act fast." They spent hours going through James's financial records. Expensive restaurants, luxury hotels, extravagant gifts for Tricia. The money was slipping through his fingers like fine sand. Liz felt a tightness in her chest seeing this. She had worked so hard to build a secure life, to have stability in her old age, and now everything was being thrown away. But at the same time, she felt something different growing inside her, a strength she didn't know she possessed. Meanwhile, James and Patricia seemed to be living in a world of their own, as if they were in a bubble of luxury and excess. They traveled to paradise-like destinations, dined at Michelin-starred restaurants, and bought clothes and accessories without any restraint. Patricia posted everything on social media, flaunting the new lifestyle she was living alongside James. Liz couldn't help but sometimes look at those posts. Each photo felt like a knife to her chest. But Mrs. Clotilde and Martha were there to remind her that this was just a phase and that she needed to stay strong in her fight. "That money, Liz, is not just his, it's yours too, and you're gonna get back what's rightfully yours," Martha would reinforce at every meeting. The battle was far from over, but Liz was no longer the submissive and frightened woman that James had left behind. She was a woman in transformation, fighting to rebuild her life, one step at a time. The legal process was about to intensify, and Liz knew that, by the end of it all, one thing was certain. She would never go back to being the woman she was before. Liz's days passed in a mix of anguish and hope. Every morning, she tried to find the strength to keep going, even with the fear of the future constantly looming. Her routine was completely different now. The moments of silence in the house were deafening, and the echo of Liz's solitary footsteps in the hallways made the loneliness seem even crueler. Martha, the lawyer, made frequent visits to discuss the progress of the case against James. They spent entire afternoons reviewing documents and gathering evidence of everything that had been built during the years of marriage. "We need records of all the transactions he's made over the last few months," Martha would say, with the firmness only an experienced lawyer possesses. Liz knew this was a difficult but necessary step to ensure she would have a future. Meanwhile, the community showed increasing involvement. The church group, led by Father Charles, organized small events to raise funds and help Liz get by while the case was underway. Mrs. Clotilde, always present, began coming by every day to help with housework and keep her company during the afternoons, bringing lighthearted conversation and words of comfort. "Liz, don't give up. This is just a rough patch, and it will pass," she'd say, trying to motivate her friend to keep going. It was during one of those afternoons, while Liz and Mrs. Desvaux Clotilde were having tea on the porch, that an unexpected scene unfolded. A luxury car pulled up in front of the house, and out stepped James, accompanied by Patricia. She was dressed in expensive clothes, flaunting a designer handbag that was clearly worth more than anything Liz owned at that moment. Liz's blood ran cold. Her heart raced, and she felt her breath grow heavy. "What is he doing here?" she thought, trying to stay calm. James walked up to the door with a forced smile on his face, while Patricia watched from a distance, arms crossed, with a look of disdain. "Liz, we need to talk," he said in a tone that mixed superiority and coldness. Without waiting for an answer, he walked into the house as if he still owned everything. Liz felt anger rising within her, but stayed firm. "James, you have no right to come in here like this. This is my house now," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. James laughed, a cold and sarcastic laugh. "Your house? Liz, we both know this house only exists because of me, and I'm here to pick up a few of my things." He then started rummaging around the living room, grabbing random items and tossing them into a leather bag he carried. Liz stood paralyzed with disbelief, not knowing how to react. She wanted to scream, to throw him out, but something held her back. Mrs. Clotilde, sensing the rising tension, moved closer and stood by Liz's side, like a shield. "James, you have no right to do this," Clotilde said, her voice surprisingly firm for a woman her age. "Everything you're doing only proves that Liz is right to take you to court." James turned with a furious look. "None of you understand anything. I'm living the life I deserve now. Finally free to do whatever I want," he replied, finishing stuffing the bag. Before leaving, he looked at Liz one last time, his gaze full of disdain. "I hope you realize soon that life moves on, Liz. Stop playing the victim." As soon as he left, Liz broke down. The tears she had held back for so long came flooding out uncontrollably. Mrs. Clotilde held her close, letting her cry as much as she needed. "He'll pay for this, Liz. He'll pay," her friend whispered, trying to calm her. The next day, Martha made an urgent visit. "Liz, we need to speed up the process," she said as she walked in. "We've obtained documents proving that James is spending the money you both accumulated on frivolities. He's going to bury himself in debt if we don't act quickly." They spent hours going over James's financial records, expensive restaurants, luxury hotels, extravagant gifts for Patricia. The money was slipping through his fingers like fine sand. Liz felt a tightness in her chest as she saw it all. She had worked so hard to build a secure life, to have stability in her later years, and now everything was being thrown away. But at the same time, she felt something different growing inside her, a strength she never knew she had. Meanwhile, James and Patricia seemed to be living in a world of their own, as if in a bubble of luxury and excess. They traveled to paradise-like destinations, dined in Michelin-starred restaurants, and bought clothes and accessories without any moderation. Patricia posted everything on social media, flaunting the new lifestyle she enjoyed with James. Liz couldn't help but look at these posts sometimes. Every picture felt like a knife to her chest. But Mrs. Clotilde and Martha were there to remind her that this was just a phase, and that she needed to stay strong in her fight. "This money, Liz, isn't just his. It's yours too, and you're going to reclaim what's rightfully yours," Martha reinforced at every meeting. The battle was far from over, but Liz was no longer the submissive, frightened woman James had left behind. She was a woman in transformation, fighting to rebuild her life, one step at a time. The legal process was about to intensify, and Liz knew that in the end, one thing was certain: she would never go back to being the woman she once was. Liz's routine continued to change with each passing day as the legal battle with James took new turns. The case was now entering a more complicated phase. Hearings, meetings with lawyers, and more documents to prove that the assets James was spending also belonged to her. Liz found herself torn between keeping her head up and trying to understand all the legal issues she never imagined she'd have to deal with. One morning, Martha came to Liz's house with a look of concern on her face. She was holding a folder full of documents. "Liz, we need to talk, and it's serious." Liz felt a chill run down her spine. They sat down at the kitchen table, and Martha began to explain. "From what we've been able to find out, just transferring properties and accounts into Patricia's name, he's trying to hide what you both own so nothing can be divided." It felt like a stab in the back to Liz. "He's taking everything from me, Martha. How could he do this?" Liz asked, tears of anger welling up in her eyes. "We built everything together. All of it was the result of years of work, of sacrifices, and now he's trying to leave me with nothing." Martha looked at her firmly. "I know this is overwhelming, Liz, but you have to stay strong. What he's doing is illegal. We're going to file an urgent motion to freeze all his assets until the court decides what rightfully belongs to you." Hearing this, Liz felt a wave of relief, even if only momentary. It was a chance to stop James from squandering all the wealth they had built together. For the first time, she felt she had control over something. But at the same time, she felt the heavy responsibility of fighting for something she never thought she would have to contest. Meanwhile, the support from neighbors and the church community continued with the same solidarity. Liz often found herself surprised to discover homemade cakes left at her door, bags of groceries donated anonymously, or notes of encouragement from people she hardly knew. Even in the darkness of the moment she was living through, Liz felt embraced by this wave of support. Father Charles, who had been following Liz's story from the beginning, made it a point to visit her weekly to offer advice and prayers. During one of these visits, as they sat in the garden, he said, "Liz, I know it's hard to understand right now, but God has a plan for you. Maybe all of this is happening so that you can find a new strength within yourself, one you didn't even know you had." Liz wanted to believe that, to find this hidden purpose in the midst of so much suffering, but she still felt that each day was a fight for survival. One afternoon, Liz decided to do something she hadn't done in years: go to a beauty salon. With the encouragement of Mrs. Clotilde, who insisted she needed to feel good about herself, Liz went to a neighborhood salon, a simple but welcoming place. When she left, with her hair freshly cut and light makeup on her face, she looked in the mirror and almost didn't recognize herself. For the first time in a long while, she saw herself not just as James's wife, but as Liz, an independent woman capable of making her own decisions. The days went by, and the case against James progressed. Each new hearing felt like a battle within a larger war. Liz had to face James in some of these sessions, and the presence of Patricia by his side made everything more painful. She would sit there beside Liz's husband, as if she'd always belonged in that place. Patricia would smile arrogantly, as if she'd already won. But Liz noticed something strange in James's eyes, something that wasn't there when he left her. He seemed nervous, almost desperate, as if he knew he was losing control of the situation. Then came the news Liz and Martha had been waiting for. The judge granted an injunction freezing all of James's assets. He could no longer sell, transfer, or spend any property or money in his name. Liz felt as though she could breathe for the first time in weeks. "This is a big step, Liz. Now we have a real chance of securing what's rightfully yours," Martha said with a determined smile. The same day they received the news, Liz had another unexpected encounter. As she was returning home after visiting Martha's office, she saw James on the sidewalk of an expensive restaurant, arguing heatedly with Patricia. Liz watched from afar, trying not to be noticed. Patricia was gesturing aggressively, while James seemed to be trying to explain himself. The conversation grew more tense, and Liz, despite herself, could hear fragments. "I'm not going to live like a poor woman, James. If you can't give me what you promised, I don't want anything more to do with you." Patricia's voice rang out, shrill in the bustle of the street. James tried to calm her down, but it was clear she didn't want to hear it. In the end, Patricia turned her back and walked away, leaving James alone, his face filled with panic and helplessness. Liz watched the scene with a mix of surprise and quiet satisfaction. For the first time, she saw James lose his confident stance, saw the man who always had everything under control be abandoned the way he had abandoned her. It was a strange feeling. Not joy at his misfortune, but a kind of silent justice, a balance being restored. Even so, Liz knew the battle was not over. She still had a long way to go to secure her rights and her independence. The news of the injunction freezing the assets was a relief, but she knew that James would find ways to try to get around the decision. The case was far from over, and Liz would need all the courage and determination to keep going. The church community organized a small gathering at her house that night. It wasn't a party to celebrate anyone's suffering, but a gathering to support Liz and show her she wasn't alone. There were prayers, words of encouragement, and moments of silence, but solidarity was present in every hug, in every comforting word Liz received. At the end of the night, as she lay down, Liz finally felt a different kind of tiredness. It wasn't just the fatigue of fighting, but a good tiredness, of someone who knows they're moving forward. She fell asleep with the certainty that no matter what happened, she was no longer the same Liz as before. She was stronger, more determined. She was finally becoming the owner of her own destiny. The next morning, Liz woke up with a new feeling, a determination stronger than she'd ever felt before. She was ready to fight for everything that was rightfully hers. With his assets frozen, James was at a standstill. Patricia had left him, and his accounts were blocked. And yet, he still tried to act as if he had control over the situation. It was almost pathetic, Liz thought. The days that followed were filled with tension. James's lawyer filed appeals, attempting to overturn the court's decision to freeze the assets. He claimed that Liz was entitled to nothing, that she was just trying to ruin James's life. But for every argument they made, Martha was ready to counter it with proof and evidence that the life they'd built belonged to both of them, not just to James. James began to feel the weight of the situation. His new life of luxury was crumbling. The finances didn't add up. The money he'd spent frivolously on Patricia seemed to have evaporated. He started going to cheaper restaurants, selling some of his expensive clothes, and to everyone's surprise, he even considered going back to his old job, something he'd sworn never to do after freeing himself. James had always boasted about his success, but little by little, the past he was trying to erase was coming back with full force. Meanwhile, Liz spent her days rebuilding her routine. Mrs. Clotilde remained by her side, and the church ladies organized a bazaar to help her sell some of the items in her home. Liz learned the value of every dollar that came in, saving money as if it were gold. She knew that money was temporary, but it was the bridge keeping her steady until the final court decision was made. One day, while Liz and Mrs. Clotilde were organizing boxes for the bazaar, Martha arrived looking serious. She carried with her a copy of James's bank statements and a set of new documents. "Liz, I have news you need to hear. Good and bad," she said as she entered, sitting down at the kitchen table. Liz braced herself for whatever was coming. "What happened?" Liz asked, her heart racing. Martha opened the folder and showed some papers to Liz. "The good news is that the court has ruled that you're entitled to half of everything accumulated during the marriage. The bad news is that there's almost nothing left." Liz felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. "What do you mean, Martha? How can there be nothing left?" She could barely process the words. All those years of sacrifice, of saving, of hard work. Had it all disappeared? "James spent almost everything, Liz," Martha said, her voice firm but gentle. "He burned through the money on trips, expensive gifts, and when he saw that the assets were being frozen, it looks like he tried to spend as much as he could before losing access to the accounts." The shock washed over Liz, and she fell silent for a moment. She knew James had been reckless, but she never imagined he would be capable of draining everything they'd built together. A whole life had been reduced to almost nothing in just a few months. The anger she felt toward James now transformed into something deeper, a contempt for everything he represented. "But there's one more thing, Liz," Martha continued. "Now that he has an official debt to you, he's going to have to work to pay you back. The judge will order him to pay you what he owes, even if that means selling what's left or going back to work. James will have to face the consequences." Liz looked at Martha and felt a mix of relief and pain. It was a small comfort to know that James would have to pay for his actions, but the sense of loss was immense. This wasn't just about money. It was the destruction of a past, of a life, of dreams. As the weeks went by, James began showing up at Liz's house more frequently, trying to negotiate. He approached her with a mix of arrogance and pleading. One day, he appeared looking worn down, his clothes disheveled, his hair unkempt. He was no longer the confident man Liz had known for so many years. He was now a shadow of his former self, a broken figure. "Liz, I need to talk to you," he said, as Liz stood impassively at the door. "I made a lot of mistakes. I spent more than I should have. And now, Patricia's left me. I need help." He seemed like a man on the brink of desperation, and it was the first time Liz had ever seen him beg for anything. Liz took a deep breath, feeling the anger and resentment boil up inside her. "And you think I can help you, James? After everything you did? After leaving me with nothing, while you enjoyed your new life without even thinking about what would happen to me?" Liz's voice was steady, but there was a latent sadness she couldn't hide. James lowered his head, his eyes avoiding hers. "I know I was wrong. I know I was an idiot, but I don't know what to do now. I have nothing, Liz. I can't pay what I owe you. I have nowhere to go." The silence between them was heavy. Liz looked at James, and for the first time in many years, she felt pity for him. Not because he was suffering, but because he had become someone so empty, so lost, that he was now reaping exactly what he had sown. Liz closed her eyes for a moment, remembering all the nights she cried alone, all the times she wondered what her life would be like moving forward, and finally she made a decision. "James, I'm going to forgive you," Liz said calmly. "I'll forgive what you did to me, but that doesn't mean I'm going to take you back, or that I'm going to forget what you did. I deserve something better than what you have to offer now, and you need to face the consequences of your actions. It's time for you to grow up and take responsibility." James, shocked, dropped to his knees in front of Liz, holding her hands. "Please, Liz, give me one more chance. I can change. I can make you happy again. I just need some time, one opportunity." Liz pulled her hands away from his, her voice firm and steady like never before. "James, the time for second chances is over. Now, I am in charge of my own life. I don't need you to be happy, and maybe that's the biggest lesson you need to learn." With that, Liz turned and walked back into her house, closing the door behind her, leaving James kneeling on the sidewalk. She felt a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She was free, finally free to decide her own fate. James stayed outside for a few minutes in silence before getting up and leaving. His head down, his posture broken. At that moment, Liz realized she had won. Not just in court, but in life. She was no longer a victim of circumstances, no longer a woman in the shadow of her ex-husband. She was a woman who had found her own strength, her own worth. And now, a new chapter of her life was just beginning. The days following that final conversation with James brought Liz a freedom she had never experienced before. The feeling of letting go of everything that had kept her trapped for years was invigorating. She spent hours on her porch, sipping coffee and reflecting on how she had come this far, how she had transformed from a submissive, dependent woman into someone independent and ready to face the future. The legal case was still ongoing, but with the judge's ruling that Liz was entitled to half of everything James had accumulated, her focus turned to what truly mattered: rebuilding her life. She began thinking about what she enjoyed, something she never had the chance to explore before. Liz loved to cook, and with the encouragement of Mrs. Clotilde and the church ladies, she started making cakes and bread to sell around the neighborhood. It was a simple start, but gradually, the orders began to increase. People from the neighborhood would stop by Liz's door to buy her homemade treats, and she began to find a purpose and joy in this new work, something she'd never experienced before. It was as if a new world had opened up before her eyes. One neighbor even suggested she take her products to the local market. At first hesitant, Liz decided to take on the challenge and set up a small table covered with a floral cloth, cakes, and sweets laid out for sale. On her first day, she sold everything. "Liz, you've got talent," Mrs. Clotilde would say with a proud smile. "You'll see, this is going to grow, and soon you'll have a little bakery." However, Liz still had to deal with the remnants of her past with James. At every court hearing, she saw him more worn out, more distant from who he used to be. James had become a desperate man, someone who no longer had the same spark in his eyes or the confident demeanor that once defined him. He was now facing debts and the pressure to pay Liz what he owed her. With the assets frozen and nearly all the money gone, James was forced to do what he had always sworn he'd never do: look for a job. One day at the market where Liz sold her cakes, she overheard some rumors that caught her by surprise. James had found work as a waiter at a modest restaurant downtown. Liz was shocked and incredulous at the same time. A man who had always thought so highly of himself was now serving tables to earn a paycheck, and part of that paycheck would go toward paying his debt to her. Time passed, and while Liz was becoming more established as a popular cook in the neighborhood, James was sinking into his new routine. Patricia, who had distanced herself as soon as she realized the money was gone, never reappeared. Friends who once accompanied their extravagant adventures also vanished. James was now alone, surrounded by strangers, working day and night to pay his bills. One afternoon, while Liz was at the market selling her cakes and bread, a familiar figure emerged from the crowd. It was James. He was wearing a simple waiter's uniform, and his face looked tired, aged. Liz wasn't sure how to react, but she stood still, waiting to see what he would do. James approached slowly, as if the weight of all his mistakes was pressing down on him. "Liz," he said, his voice low and hoarse. I need to talk to you." Liz looked at him firmly, but there was no longer anger in her gaze, just indifference. "What do you want, James?" He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice trembling. "I know I messed up, and I hurt you a lot. But Liz, my life is a mess. I've lost everything. The money, Patricia, my friends. I'm completely alone and lost. And I know you have no reason to listen to me, but I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything I put you through." Liz remained silent, feeling a mix of emotions. For so long, she had wanted to hear those words from James, but now that they were finally coming out of his mouth, they felt empty. His regret didn't change what had happened. It didn't erase the lonely nights, the abandonment, or the struggles she had faced on her own. "I understand that you're sorry, James," Liz said calmly, "but I don't need your forgiveness to move on. I've learned to live for myself, to value myself. You, on the other hand, will have to learn to deal with the consequences of your choices. That's something only you can do." James lowered his head, and Liz could see that he was crying. She didn't feel pity, but she didn't feel satisfaction either. It was as if, in that moment, their entire history was being left behind, finally laid to rest. He tried to continue speaking, but the words were lost in his sobs. Liz then touched his arm and said, "James, I hope you find your way truly, but our path together is over." She turned and walked back to her stall at the market, leaving James alone, lost in the crowd. Liz felt as if she had closed a chapter, as if she could finally move forward without the weight of the past. There, behind her stall, surrounded by the scent of fresh cakes and bread, Liz realized that she had indeed rebuilt her life. A life she chose, one she built on her own, and one that no one could ever take from her again. That night, back at home, Liz sat in the living room armchair and looked out at the sky through the window. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: it now belonged only to her. And for the first time in a long while, Liz smiled, a smile full of peace, pride, and hope. The days that followed brought Liz a new sense of peace and independence. Each morning, she woke up motivated to continue her work in the kitchen, refining her recipes, testing new flavors, and building a loyal clientele. The cakes and bread she sold at the market became a hit, and in no time, she managed to save a good amount of money. For the first time in years, Liz was making plans for the future. Then a new opportunity arose. The neighborhood church proposed that Liz open a small cafe in partnership with the community. It would be a welcoming space where she could sell her recipes daily and provide a place for people to gather, talk, and support one another. The idea excited Liz, and she immediately began planning what the cafe would look like, the decor, and how it could grow with the support of her neighbors. Meanwhile, James was still working at the downtown restaurant. Every day was a struggle for him. A man who once saw himself as superior was now serving customers who treated him as invisible. The confident posture he once held had disappeared, replaced by a figure who looked defeated and aged. He seemed to have lost all the sparkle in his eyes, and the smile he once wore so freely during his prosperous days had become a rare feature on his tired face. Liz learned through mutual friends that James was living in a small rented room at the back of the restaurant where he worked. He had no savings, no comfort, and most importantly, no prospects. Every now and then, she would receive messages from him, awkward attempts at reconciliation or apologies. But Liz no longer felt the weight of those messages. His regret was the result of his choices, and she knew it wasn't her responsibility to help him find a new path. One Sunday afternoon during Mass, Father Charles delivered a sermon that deeply moved Liz. He spoke about forgiveness and the importance of finding true inner peace. Forgiveness, he said, is not about absolving the other of their wrongs. It's about freeing your own heart to live without the bitterness those wrongs have left behind. After the Mass, as everyone gathered in the hall next to the church, Father Charles approached Liz. "My dear, I see that you've been walking with renewed strength. It's inspiring to all of us," he said with a gentle smile. Liz nodded, a light shining in her eyes. "It's true, Father. I think I've finally learned to live for myself and move forward." The father observed her for a moment and then asked, "And forgiveness, Liz? Have you been able to forgive?" Liz fell silent, pondering the question. She had told James that she forgave him, but had she really done so in her heart? Could she fully let go of any resentment? Liz knew that forgiveness was a process, and perhaps she was still in the midst of it, trying to find the right path. That night at home, Liz found herself reflecting on her past. She pulled out some old photos from the closet, images from her youth with James, when everything seemed simple and full of dreams. There were happy moments, of course, and Liz couldn't deny that they had shared many good years together. But as she looked at those photos, she realized something important. Her identity had always been defined by the marriage, by James's will, by the role he had imposed on her. Now, looking at her present, she saw something different. She saw a woman who had rediscovered her passion for life, reconnected with her community, and found out that she could be independent, work, and take care of herself. She was no longer James's wife. She was Liz, a strong, capable woman in charge of her own destiny. The next day, the news everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The court had given its final decision. Liz was entitled to half of all the assets James had accumulated during their marriage. But as Martha had predicted, those assets were worth very little now. With the debts and reckless spending, the wealth had been reduced to practically nothing. Even so, Liz felt victorious. She had won a battle that once seemed impossible, and that was enough for her. James, on the other hand, was ordered to work and pay the debt to Liz in installments. It was a long and difficult process, meaning he would have to stay at his job as a waiter for quite some time. The humiliation of having to work to pay the woman he abandoned was a burden he didn't know how to carry. He grew more bitter, more withdrawn, and his presence became ghostly, a shadow of the man he used to be. One afternoon, while Liz was at the market organizing her products, a woman approached her stand. She was a regular customer, but that day, she brought some news. "Liz, I have a friend who owns a cafe downtown and is looking for someone to supply homemade cakes and bread. I thought of you immediately." The offer felt like a confirmation that the universe was conspiring in Liz's favor. In no time, she had a new contract, supplying cakes and bread to the cafe in the city, and her small home business was growing rapidly. She even started to consider the idea of buying her own space, maybe opening her own cafe, a place that was all hers. Meanwhile, James continued to work at the restaurant. He had become an isolated figure, almost invisible to those around him. The restaurant owners treated him with disdain, and customers barely noticed him. The man who once took pride in his wealth and lifestyle now lived day by day in a simple uniform, with a lost look in his eyes. One night, Liz was at home, preparing new recipes for the next day when she heard a soft knock on the door. She opened it and, to her surprise, found James standing there. He was thinner, with deep circles under his eyes and a look of utter desperation. "Liz, please, hear me out. I'm completely lost. Everything I've tried has gone wrong. I have no one. I have nothing. I know I hurt you. I know I messed up. But please, help me. Let me come back home." Liz looked at him silently for a long moment. There stood the man she had loved for so many years, now on his knees, begging for a second chance. But she knew that wasn't her life anymore. That was a story she had already left behind. "James, I've already forgiven you. I've let go of all the hurt. But what you're asking me to do, I can't. I've built a new life, a life that no longer has room for this past." James began to cry, tears streaming down his face uncontrollably. He tried to take Liz's hands, but she gently pulled them away. "I hope you find peace, James, truly. But that peace isn't here with me. It's within you in the choices you make from now on." She closed the door and walked away without looking back. Liz knew that by doing so, she was finally free. Free to be who she had always wanted to be. Time continued to pass, and Liz felt that her life was finally taking an unexpected and wonderful turn. The partnership with the city cafe was going very well, and Liz was starting to be recognized as the best baker in the neighborhood. The production of cakes, bread, and sweets grew daily, and she decided it was time to invest in her own space. After some visits to properties and discussions with friends who helped her plan, Liz found a small place to rent near the church. It was simple but welcoming and had the perfect potential to become the cafe of her dreams. As she prepared the renovations and decoration for the space, Liz was filled with a mix of nerves and excitement. Her entire life had been spent in the shadow of a marriage that limited her, and now she was about to open the doors of her own business, something she never thought possible. She took care of every detail, from the color of the walls to the choice of cups and plates. In Liz's cafe, every detail would be an expression of the woman she had become. When the opening day finally arrived, Liz was nervous but confident. Father Charles was the first to show up, accompanied by Mrs. Clotilde and other church ladies, all with proud smiles on their faces. "Liz, dear, you did it! I'm so happy for you," Mrs. Clotilde said, hugging her tightly. Liz returned the hug with gratitude, holding back tears that insisted on falling. The little cafe, which Liz named Cafe Hope, in honor of this new phase of her life, gradually filled with people throughout the day. Neighbors, friends from the market, and even people who had never heard of her, but were curious about all the activity. The joy was contagious, and Liz felt exhilarated seeing all those months of hard work finally come to life. "One cappuccino and a slice of your famous carrot cake, please!" Orders and more orders came in, and Liz was in the kitchen with her apron dusted in flour, laughing and feeling more alive than ever. Compliments came quickly. "Your cake is delicious! This is the best coffee in town! Liz, you're an inspiration!" Each word warmed her heart, and she couldn't stop smiling. While Liz's cafe flourished, James's life continued to wither. Working at the restaurant helped him pay off debts and fulfill his obligations to Liz, but his heart was empty. Sometimes he would walk past the cafe Liz had opened, watching from afar but never finding the courage to go in. He knew there was no place for him there anymore. Each time he looked inside and saw Liz smiling, chatting with customers, laughing with friends, he was reminded of what he had lost. And more than the money or assets, what hurt James most was losing Liz, a woman he had never truly valued. One lonely night, James sat on his bed in the small room he rented. Beside him, a half-empty bottle of beer and a stack of bills he couldn't pay. He had lost everything. The new companion he had traded Liz for a life of luxury had left him as soon as the money began to dry up. Friends who were always around before had disappeared. He felt more alone than ever. Then, in a desperate impulse, He picked up the phone and dialed Liz's number. His finger hovered over the call button, but he knew that if he didn't do it now, he might never have another chance. After a few seconds of silence, he finally pressed call. Liz, who was closing the cafe after a long day of work, looked at her phone and saw James's name on the screen. She felt a tightness in her chest. She knew the call would probably be another attempt to apologize or even beg for help. She thought about not answering, but then she took a deep breath and decided to pick up, not knowing exactly why. "Hello," Liz answered, her voice steady but calm. On the other end, James was silent for a moment before speaking, his voice trembling and choked with emotion. "Liz, I have no right to call you. I know that. But I needed to talk to you. I'm completely lost. I know you've moved on. I know I'm not part of your life anymore, but please, Liz, I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. And if there's any chance at all, for you to forgive me and let me come back, I'd do anything." Liz closed her eyes, letting James's words echo in her mind. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice calm but full of conviction. "James, I forgave you a long time ago. I don't hold any grudges, no hard feelings. What happened, happened, and today I understand that it was meant to be. But I also understand that this new life I'm building has no more room for the past. There's no more space for us." On the other end, James let out a sob. "I know, Liz, I know," he replied, his voice weak, almost imperceptible. "I just don't know how to move forward." "You have to find your own way, James," Liz said. "Just like I found mine. I hope you can, truly. But now I need to live my life without looking back." Liz hung up the phone and sighed. She knew that would be the last call. James needed to find his own peace, and she needed to keep walking the path she chose, without any more ties or regrets. The next day, Liz woke up feeling lighter. She went to the cafe and opened the doors for another day of work, greeting customers with her gentle smile and offering her freshly baked goods. And as she looked up at the sign of Cafe Hope, Liz smiled to herself. Hope was there, in every morning, every recipe, in every new beginning. And she knew, more than ever, that she was exactly where she was always meant to be. It was a sunny morning at Cafe Hope. Liz stood behind the counter, preparing fresh batches of bread that would soon be devoured by customers. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, and the small line at the entrance showed how the cafe had become a beloved gathering spot for everyone in the neighborhood. Liz had found her purpose, her happiness, and she knew that the path she had traveled to get there had transformed her into the woman she was today, free, confident, and independent. As she served customers and chatted with Mrs. Clotilde, who was now her loyal helper at the cafe, Liz reflected on how drastically her life had changed in recent months. It was hard to believe that not so long ago, James had left her, and she was completely lost, unsure of how to move forward. Now, her cafe was her passion. Her home was fuller than ever with friends, and she felt like her journey of self-discovery was just beginning. That same afternoon, as Liz was arranging a new batch of cakes, Martha, the lawyer and friend who had helped her throughout the legal process, walked into the cafe, a proud smile on her face. "Liz, this place looks more beautiful every day, and always packed," she said as she grabbed a chair and sat down for a coffee. Liz, beaming with pride, served a slice of cake and a cup of hot coffee to Martha, who watched her with admiration. "You did it, Liz. Truly. Look at you. You built a new life, your way, and with great success." Liz smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Martha. You were my strength when I had nothing left." Martha shook her head humbly. "I only showed you the path, Liz. You were the one who walked it." Throughout their conversation, Martha shared the latest updates on the legal proceedings against James. He was following the court's instructions and making payments regularly. The money he was required to repay to Liz would be enough for her to further invest in the cafe and build a comfortable life. But for Liz, the money was no longer the focal point. The value she had rediscovered was far more important: confidence in herself and the ability to for what she deserved. As the two laughed and talked about the future, Liz looked out onto the street and saw a scene she never imagined would have so little impact on her. James, standing on the other side of the sidewalk, watching her through the cafe window. He was dressed in his waiter's uniform, with a weary expression and slumped shoulders. He seemed lost, more alone than ever, but Liz felt neither pity nor anger, just a calm, distant compassion. They were like two strangers now, people who had shared a story but had gone down completely different paths. James hesitated for a moment as if considering walking into the cafe. But then, he lowered his head and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Liz watched him until he was out of sight, and as she saw him leave, she felt something close within her. There were no more debts to settle, no more words to say. Everything had been resolved. James was part of the past, and she was ready to live in the present. That night, Liz closed the cafe with the help of Mrs. Clotilde, who was talking excitedly about the cafe's expansion plans. "You'll see, Liz. Soon you'll need to hire more people, and this place will be the main hub of the town." Liz laughed, but a part of her knew it was true. Her business was growing, and she was more excited than ever to see how far it could go. When she got home, tired but happy, Liz made herself a cup of chamomile tea, as she did every night. She sat on the porch, feeling the evening breeze on her face and looking up at the starry sky. For the first time in many years, she felt peace, a true peace. It wasn't the peace that comes from the absence of problems, but the peace of knowing that she had overcome every obstacle, every pain, and emerged stronger. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but now she had something she never had before, the certainty that she could handle whatever came her way. The future was uncertain, but Liz was ready to embrace it, with all the challenges and joys it would bring. She had left behind the chains that once bound her, and now she flew free, in charge of herself and her destiny. And as she closed her eyes that night, Liz fell asleep with a smile on her face, knowing she was exactly where she was meant to be.